Nurses of psych wards, what did a patient do that left you speechless? Probably the saddest was a resident I had a long time ago. This gentleman was a WW2 vet with Alzheimer's and dementia. Probably once or twice a month, he would relive some battle he was in. He would literally run up the hallway and grab you and yell at you to get down behind the sandbags. He would then tell you take his Thompson. Because it was too heavy for him, he would just use his pistol. Then he would get up and run back down the hallway. This guy was old, and seeing him run full sprint like that up and down the hallway during one of his episodes was surreal. I can't imagine having to constantly relive the worst moments of your life where you witnessed and survived the unspeakable horrors of war. One of our patients escaped the ward and managed to hitchhike all the way to Sydney, about 900 kilometers. A nurse told me one of her patients killed himself on the unit while on 1-1 suicide watch. Edit. Patient and staff were at arm's length, and patient suddenly charged the wall, smashing his head as hard as he could, breaking his neck in the process. We had a geropsych floor. Crazy old people. One night while passing through, a little old lady popped her head out her doorway and said to me, "I could sure use the company of a good-looking young man tonight. Sorry, I'm not that good looking." Quick as snot on a doorknob, she said. "That's okay, I can't see too well." I didn't join her, but her charisma was on point. I watched a guy try to remove rats from his rectum. Stated that his ex-girlfriend summoned them there. He ended up tearing his rectal walls to shreds. Had a catatonic guy who could play the piano like a pro, classic, jazz, ragtime, but otherwise just sat in his chair and stared. Not a nurse, pharmacist. Had one of our clozapine patients miss a monthly meeting to discuss their medication. Called around, found out she was in the ICU having eaten 2 of her own fingers, then visited her mother for coffee, still bleeding. Had a friend tell me of another patient, made a cut in his thigh and reopened it regularly until the whole thing was a scar tissue cavern, by some miracle avoiding infection. Started using his meat pocket to hold pens and coins, and anything he could collect in his ward. Nobody knew until a paperclip pierced the side, and he finally wound up with an infection that took him to ICU, where they found his stash. Not a nurse, but I used to be a security guard in a hospital, and we had a patient who self-harmed and cut a hole into themselves around their belly button, and then stuck a bunch of paper clips and buttons and things like that into it. When I was in nursing school, I had a clinical in the state-funded psych ward downtown. I was assigned to sit with this one girl to monitor her behavior. She spent about 30 minutes doing nothing but eating pudding cups with a plastic spoon. She ate like 6 of them in half an hour. Then out of nowhere she very calmly licked her spoon completely clean and pulled her shirt sleeve up before shoving the entire spoon into an incision in her arm near her bicep. Then very calmly said, "Ops." The nurses that worked there didn't believe me. They kept saying I was making it up and that I couldn't have seen what I saw. Only later on, like 4 hours later, it was a 12 hours clinical, the orderly noticed the girl had some blood on her shirt. He took her into her room to change her clothes and noticed that an incision on her arm had dehisced and had been bleeding. Then eventually agreed to send her to the hospital for testing. The x-ray showed the entire spoon sucked into the fat of her upper arm through an incision where they'd removed a birth control implant in the week before. Apparently the girl had slowly been picking at the sutures and opening it bit by bit until it was deep enough to fit an entire plastic spoon. The girl admitted that the ops was because it had gotten in and couldn't be pulled out, not because she stuck a spoon in her arm. Totally bizarre. We had a psych patient on our floor that wasn't really crazy, just really confused and unpleasant in general. One night I was mixing his drink with some thickener, and per usual he started yelling about me poisoning him. I explained what it was, and that we are all here to help him, not hurt him, and he responds with, "I'm just going to die." His vitals were fine, he was alert, no red flags, and like I said, he was always pretty unpleasant, so I didn't think much of it. Sure as, he coded an hour later, and we never got him back. Edit. Coded is slang for code blue, which is what they call over intercom or pagers when someone stopped breathing or their heart has stopped. My sister was actually sectioned earlier this year for her eating disorder. She shouldn't have been. but that's a story for another time, and she was right next to the PICU, psychiatric intensive care unit. One of the nights, she heard multiple screams coming specifically from that ward. One of the patients had bit a chunk out of a nurse's leg as they were trying to detain them. They then started eating said chunk. It's crazy to think these types of things happen. Edit. Sorry guys, I typed psychiatric instead of pediatric. She was only 15, so it was PICU. I just had a bit of a brain confusion. Psych ward counselor here. Early in my career, I had a teenage girl with suicidal ideations and severe depression. The year before, on Thanksgiving, her dad pulled a gun from under the dinner table and blew his brains out in front of everyone. I normally form a response pretty quickly, even a wow, but when she told me I got quiet, leaned back, exhaled, and had to gather my thoughts. Not a nurse, but I was a patient in a psych ward. The ward was sectioned into two sides, based on case severity. I was on the less severe side. One night, an incredibly tall, somewhat muscular man escaped his room on the severe side, got through a door that was supposed to be locked, got into the less severe side, and into my room. I woke up, sat up, and saw him standing in my doorway. He asked in a shaky voice if I was alright. I hesitantly said yes, to which he responded by getting a look of terrified horror and screamed, "I knew it. You can see them too. Don't let them get you," before he was dragged away screaming by security. When I was a student, doing a placement in a maximum security unit, a serial rapist was getting meds, made a silly joke. The nurse said, "Oh, stop that." His response was, "I've heard that before." Was interviewing a guy in psych ward, and he was complaining about how he couldn't have any whiteout, a liquid eraser for typewriters, because he was on suicide watch. Claimed it was stupid, because if he wanted to kill himself, as he pointed out, he could use the drawstring from the blinds to hang himself, or he could use his pencil to stab himself, or use a typewriter metal bar to off himself. I agreed it was silly to hold back the small bottle of liquid whiteout. When I relayed the convo to my instructor about how silly it seemed, due to him having several other ways, she replied that he proved to me that he had been considering ways to kill himself, and that's why he was able to come up with so many so quickly. He never did get his whiteout. I visited a prison for a warden job, and went to see the constant surveillance guys, for their own safety etc. There was a fella there, who had used a razor to slice his stomach open, and started pulling chunks of himself out for fun. He also started using the hole, which wouldn't heal, as a hiding place. A towel was found stuffed in there, which his body had started fusing to. Apparently he was quite nice, but the whole thing wasn't for me, and I didn't go ahead with applying. Edit. For those posting r/thathup, and I suggest reading this topic and doing research on what seriously ill patients can do to themselves if you think I'd make this up. Not me, but my dad used to work in Arrowdale and J Ward, Australian Insane Asylum and Prison for the Criminally Insane, respectively, in the 70s. He used to talk about sunny days in J Ward, where they'd bring out all the inmates during a sunny day, and they'd promptly line up and start jacking off. In Arrowdale they'd deal with the jacking off problem by strapping you into cotton mittens, but a lot of the inmates would chew a hole through them just to get a finger out to jack off with. His worst story was about a psychotic woman in Arrowdale. She had self-inflicted scars all over her face from scratching herself, self-imposed bite marks all over her body from trying to eat herself, and she had the nasty habit of chewing the inside of her mouth and spitting blood at your eyes and mouth, hoping you'd catch one of the myriad of diseases she carried. I'm not a nurse, but was a patient once. Giant dude got upset. One dude changed the channel from a football game he was watching and smashed his skull with his fists. Not fully, but enough that when they brought him back a few days later he started seizing and had to be removed again. Didn't see him again. Also, there was one lady who was straight out of the movies, walking around preaching the end of days loudly and sweating like crazy. I'm an RN in Boston in a psych hospital, and I've seen some. One of the things I'll never ever forget was we had this manic guy that had been transferred from another unit cause he kept getting in fights over there and all the other patients were trying to attack him. I was still working nights back then, and at about 3 AM, He came up to me and said his tooth hurt and he needed to see a dentist right away. I said I don't have a dentist for him to see, but when the doctor comes in the morning we can take a look. Gave him some Tylenol and sent him back to bed. About 5 minutes later, he came out saying it really hurt and he needed to see a dentist to pull his tooth. Again I told him there's no dentist, but maybe I can get some more pain meds. In the middle of me explaining this to him, he sticks his hand in his mouth and rips his molar out of his head and handed it to me. Blood starts pouring out of his mouth, but he didn't even seem to notice. After I clean him up and get the bleeding to stop and call the doctor to get him some Ativan, he goes, "Make sure you give me that tooth back when I leave. That's my tooth, don't try and steal it." Wild.